Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I'm excited to be here today with Paulo Juarez. Paulo is a friend of mine, and I realized that we were part of, I think it's the Thomism discussion group, and he offered to discuss both an abductive cosmological argument and Aquinas's existential proof, both arguments for the existence of God. So I think I'll have Paulo introduce himself first and just talk a little bit about himself and what inspired you to get into philosophy? Because if I remember properly, you said you were a photographer first, and then you kind of got into philosophy. And if I'm not mistaken, Cameron Bertuzzi kind of has the same story. So it's interesting
Yeah,
to see that connection.
yeah, that's funny. I was just thinking about Cameron also, and I have another friend of mine who also is part of a group on Facebook for about Thomistic metaphysics, and he's also a photographer. So there's a lot of photographers slash philosophers for some reason. Um, so first of all, thanks, Swan, for the invite to do this. If at any point I cut out, let me know and I can kind of repeat myself. So my name is Paulo. I'm primarily a portrait and fashion photographer, but I'm an independent researcher with an interest in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science. And I guess as far as the question of how I got interested interested in philosophy, it was pretty much a desire to find out what the truth of things was. There was a time when I was sort of trying to figure things out with respect to the ultimate questions. You know, does God exist? Um, those really, really big questions. And part of what led me into philosophy was trying to resolve what I perceived as a tension between, the old canard of, the so-called conflict between science and religion. Um, and so I began trying to pursue that question, trying to see what this conflict was all about, whether there truly was a conflict. And so that was one of my very first philosophical investigations. That's something that sort of propelled me into the field. And then after that, it just naturally graduated from there into, sort of deeper questions such as the existence of God, and then just general questions about metaphysics, right? You know, um, what is the questions about ontology, questions about the composition of the world, the sorts of questions that naturally lead into the project of natural theology. Um, and then also questions about um, just the overall project of science, right? Questions about the laws of nature, questions about what is science properly speaking. Um, and those are interests that pretty much carry over to this day. You know, I think it just basically just stemmed from a desire to figure out the truth of things.
So how long ago did this journey start for you? Was this like, fairly recent, or was it a long time that you've been, doing your own independent research or?
I would say this started probably about 9 or 10 years ago
Okay.
now.
So you've
So
been
I
at it for a while.
just yeah, a while, yeah. And I grew up as a somewhere between an atheist and agnostic for the majority of my life. And it was this particular project that led me into coming into belief in God, and then also into persisting in that belief. And uh, nowadays, I'm very much interested in the project of what we'll be talking about today, which is natural theology, arguments for the existence of God, but also arguments, obviously, against the existence of God and all those questions surrounding it.
All right, well, let's just dive right into the arguments. So the first argument that you have here is the abductive cosmological argument. So while you get your slides out, I'll just kind of maybe introduce a little bit of it, right? Like I won't
Yeah.
start going down the premises or anything. So
No worries.
I take it that like a cosmological arguments deal with some fact about the entire world. And
Hmm.
they try and they try to argue like, here's this fact about the world that requires like some explanation, and it has an explanation of some sort that seems awfully close to what we would consider God. And I think the abductive cosmological argument attempts to do something like that. But let me get your thoughts on it first.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess one slight that's perfect. Yeah, one slight correction that I would make with respect to what a cosmological argument is. Um, a cosmological argument doesn't necessarily proceed from the totality of the world. Some cosmological arguments proceed from uh, can proceed from a particular feature of the world, and then from that they can go on to try to reach the conclusion that the world as a whole, right,
Hmm.
requires an explanation in terms of some transcendent or personal cause, which most religious traditions understand to be God. And so, for example, the contingency argument. You can say that the contingency argument is a cosmological argument in the sense that it seeks to explain the existence of the contingency of the world, right? But of course, a cosmological argument like a contingency argument can proceed from particular things in the world, particular contingent things, and from that move on to explain the totality of contingent things, for example. Um, but yeah, that's spot on. And you mentioned that this argument that we're going to be talking about first is an abductive cosmological argument. Um, the reason why this is an abductive cosmological argument as opposed to something like a deductive contingency argument is that this particular argument is an argument to the best explanation, right? So it's a probabilistic argument. It's not going to be a deductive argument, like, for example, some versions of the contingency argument. But it's a little bit more modest in the sense that it proceeds a little bit in a scientific sense, right? We're trying to give the best explanation for why the world exists. So this particular argument is a cosmological argument in the sense that it does proceed from the totality of the world to the existence of a transcendent and personal cause.
All right. Well, I see on this first slide here, you're going to be talking about, abductive versus deductive reasoning.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. You ready for me to
oh yeah, just
Can
dive
I get
right in,
going?
man. Dive right
Okay.
in.
All right, let's do it. So, okay, so again, this is an abductive cosmological argument that we're going to be talking about. It's an argument that um, it's not novel to me. It's an argument that I initially found in the work of a philosopher named Hugh McCann in his work. I think it's called "Creation and the Sovereignty of God," and it's not an argument uh, that I had been interested in before. Typically I don't put a lot of stock in arguments that are abductive in the sense of, arguments like the fine-tuning argument would be an example of an abductive argument. Um, but the more I dug into this argument, the more that I became convinced of it. And now we'll go on to talk about why I chose this argument over a deductive argument. But the basic difference between an abductive and a deductive argument is that an abductive argument is an argument to the best explanation, whereas a deductive argument is an argument where the conclusion pretty much follows from the validity of its premises. So if you have a syllogism like all men are mortal, and then Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, then that conclusion necessarily follows if the premises are valid. So let me go to the next slide. There we go. So the way this argument will work is I'm going to try to defend a contention. And the contention is that the existence of the world calls for an explanation. This is part of a larger paper that I'm working on, in which I actually defend two contentions. So the first contention is going to be um, that the existence of the world calls for an explanation, but the second one is going to be um, that uh, the persistence of the world from moment to moment also calls for an explanation. And the conclusion of this argument is going to be that the existence of the world is the outcome of a personal creator who is responsible for creating the world. So that's where we start. And I would want to begin, first of all, with a simple but profound observation, and that's simply that the world exists. But we can ask why. Why does the world exist? Surely it didn't have to exist, right? I mean, the neither the initial conditions or the constants or the physical laws of the universe are fixed. Um, and so it seems from this fact sufficiently obvious that if we appeal to cosmological models that describe how the world might have been under different circumstances, so a world that might have had different physical constants and so on, um, that aspect of conceivability is enough to show that the world could have been other than what it is. Um, so, put differently, the very fact that the initial conditions, physical constants, and the laws of nature can be described in different mathematical terms as being or having been other than what they are is itself evidence that their values are not fixed or necessary.
Yeah, if you
And
don't mind if I can hop in here really quick,
yeah,
just for clarification. So is the argument that the existence of a world like ours requires an explanation, or like the existence of any world that has some basic set of features requires an explanation, if that makes
that's
sense?
yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good distinction. And it would be the first case that the
Hmm.
existence of a world like ours is what calls for an explanation. Um, it's not part of this argument uh, to contend that the world is a contingent thing,
Hmm.
um, or that the totality of the world is contingent. But um, I mean, if it were, then the second proposition that basically any world that is somewhat similar to ours would also require an explanation. That would be the case. But what I want to contend, as you'll see a little bit later, is that
Hmm.
this particular world that we have requires an explanation. So that's what we're going to try to be explaining.
All right.
Um, but the main point is that we can ask why the world exists, and the fact that we can conceive of a world that is different than ours just goes on to show that this world is not necessarily. So there must be some sort of explanation as to why we have this particular world. Um, Let me go down a little bit. Oh, I skipped a. There we go. So there's a long tradition of expressing wonder at the existence of the world. You have somebody like Leibniz, who famously declared that the first philosophical question that should be rightly asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? We have Wittgenstein, who also expressed something similar when he said that it is not how the world is that is mystical, but that it is. And so I want to begin with that perplexing fact, right, that there's a world at all. Um, there's a couple ways in which somebody might try to block this particular project that we're gonna be engaged in. One objection would be to say that the question as to why the world exists is just not legitimate, right? Somebody can just reject the inquiry altogether. Um, an objector could just say that the question is really a pseudo question that can just be rejected out of hand. Um, but I think this is untenable, and you can imagine or consider with me the following scenario from philosopher Richard Taylor. Suppose that you're walking through the woods, and then suddenly you come across a glowing, translucent ball. The ball is just lying there, right? Um, you wouldn't really think that there, I mean, you would think that there must be some sort of explanation as to why the ball was there and where it came from. It's pretty doubtful that anybody would look at this object um, pretty much with no sense of perplexity and then just um, content themselves with believing that it's just there and that's all that can be said of it. Um, it seems obvious that a lot more could be said of it, and you would want to say more about that. But suppose now that the ball were larger, right? Say that it's as large as a house. Now the ball definitely has your attention, right? Um, what if the ball were as large as an island? What if it were as large as a planet? I mean, the perplexity would just grow and grow. But then finally, consider the ball. Imagine the ball were as large as the entire universe. Um, I really doubt that anybody would suggest that its existence would not cry for an explanation. And so it's difficult then to deny the legitimacy of the question that we're considering, right? Why does anything at all exist? Um, Another possible way of blocking the inquiry is to say, basically, to appeal to mystery, right? So, according to this view, the question of why there is a world is legitimate, but it's not why. It's unanswerable. Um, so you can ask the question, but there's just no answer that can be given. And to this, all I would want to say is maybe, right? But that's something that remains to be demonstrated. And it's, after all, the contention of the cosmological argument that there is a concrete answer to be had. There is a best explanation for why the
Hey, Paulo, can you hear me? Oh, yeah, that was weird. Cut out for a second. Yeah.
Uh-oh. Okay. Should we start from the beginning or?
No, so you were talking about what is it? You were talking about the appeal to when someone appeals to mystery in order to avoid, right? Um, the question of why the universe exists, why the world exists. Um, I mean, you can just start there again, and that's fine.
Okay. Cool. Um, yeah. So basically, an appeal to mystery would just basically be to
Oh,
say
and
that.
don't forget to share your screen. Yeah.
Yep. Let's see here. Oh wow. Yeah. Everything died. Crazy. Okay. Here we go. I think. And present. Okay. So an appeal to mystery would be basically to say that you can ask why there is a world, right? But the
Paulo,
question
don't
is not.
forget to share your screen.
Let me see here. Okay. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
There we go. Cool. Make big. Okay. An appeal to mystery is basically the claim that you can ask the question why there is a world, but you can't really answer it. Um, and all I want to say here is that that's something that remains to be demonstrated. Um, because after all, it's the contention of the cosmological argument that there is a concrete answer to be had. There is a best explanation for why the world exists. Um, and surely the best explanation available is more probable than no explanation at all, other things being equal. So, with that in mind, I think that's enough of a background that we can actually turn into the argument now, which begins here. So, this is the outline of the argument that I want to be talking about. The abductive cosmological argument. In its most simple form, it's going to run something like this. Premise one: plausibly, if a creative and personal cause undertook to create a world like ours, then it would surely exist. But the world does exist. So plausibly, the world is the result of a creative and personal cause. And then finally, premise four: this creative and personal cause is God. Um, so, like you mentioned earlier, the argument proceeds from the fact that there is a world like ours, not just a world at all, but a world with the features that our world has. And it's those two facts, that conjunction of those two facts, that we're trying to explain. And the conclusion is going to be that God is going to be the best explanation of why our particular world exists. Um, just to clarify, by the world, um, I'm probably going to be using the world, the universe, just kind of interchangeably. But basically, what I mean is the totality of all physical reality. Or you could say any reality other than God, should God exists, right? I
Hmm.
don't want to beg the question, but basically that's what we have in mind. If God exists, God would not be the sort of reality that would be included within the universe. So, let's see here. So again, this is an argument to the best explanation, and the argument is going to hold that in light of competing hypotheses, the hypothesis that the existence of the world finds its ultimate explanation in God is what should be preferred. Um, Basically, in other words, the strength of the conclusion, even if it lacks absolute certainty, I mean, whatever that might mean, is going to be on par with the certainty that one expects from the most robust of scientific hypotheses, right? Um, so, a scientific hypothesis is said to be persuasive to the extent that it has greater explanatory power over other theories, over other factors. Um, and it's a similar thing what we're trying to do here. A scientific theory is never going to reach absolute certainty, um, since it's always possible that some new theory may come along and undermine whatever the present paradigm is. But still, scientific theories can be quite convincing, even if they're abductive in nature.
Before we continue really quick too, I'm
Yeah.
interested in that first premise. So, um, if a creative and personal cause undertook to create a world like ours, then it would surely exist. If you could unpack that for the audience just piece by piece, I think that would be really helpful because there's a lot actually going on in that first premise that's quite interesting. So,
Yeah, yeah, sure. So what what the first premise is trying to get at is that um, if if there were a creative and personal cause, then that creative and personal cause would set out to create a world, first of all, and it would set out to create a world with the features that our world has.
mm-hmm,
That's the hypothesis that we're beginning. So this is
mm-hmm,
the main thing to keep in mind is that one should not look at this argument in a deductive sense. The premise one is primarily the hypothesis that we're beginning with. Um, and so when I say that plausibly, if a creative and personal cause undertook to create a world like ours, that section like ours, what that means, as we'll see a little bit later, is a world with the features that our world has, right? Um, a world that includes the existence of things that are not self-existent, um, things that um, um, what do I want to say? A world that includes not only physical realities but also abstracta, in the sense of universals, sets, propositions, truths, those sorts of things. So basically, a world that includes more than just physical reality, and a
mm-hmm,
world that includes the physical reality in the way that it does. So, for example, our world could be said to be orderly, right? And that is one particular feature of our world that requires explanation. And that feature will also be part of our hypothesis as that which we're trying to explain. I don't know if that helps a little bit.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, what's really important too is, you had the two contentions at the bottom, and what was it? The world need not have existed. I mean, that kind of explains why the first premise is saying then it would surely exist, right?
Yes,
There we go. All right,
exactly.
all
Yes,
right. I'm ready to move on.
good point. Okay, so let's see. Here we go. So I want to begin first with the fact of the world's existence, right? The fact that there is a world rather than no world at all. Given that the world need not have existed, um, we need a satisfactory explanation for why it does exist. Um, and I want to note from the outset that what we're concerned with this particular argument is with what ontologically explains or even grounds the existence of the world, and not so much with how long the world has existed, right? Um, so this is not an argument for a beginning of the universe, or an argument for the impossibility of a past infinite universe. I would be happy to concede, um, even despite the findings of modern physics, that the world has always existed, and yet we would still need to explain why there is a world at all, given that things could have been otherwise. Um, and again, I want to note that by the world or the universe, we're trying to describe the totality of physical reality and not just the universe that we inhabit, but also any other universes that may be actual. Should there be um, universes other than our own? That's something that I just leave open as a possibility. Um, to my mind, it would seem circular to try to explain the existence of the totality of physical reality by appealing to some portion of physical reality. Um, hopefully that makes sense. But given, oh, I jumped. There we go. Given that the world cannot be explained by appeal to some portion of the world on pain of circularity, and given that the world need not have existed, it would seem like the best explanation for why the world exists is something that would be found um, in 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 some reality that both transcends the universe but also causes it to be. Um, so that would be the beginnings of 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 the hypothesis that we're proposing. But obviously, we're going to want to say more if this theory um, is going to have greater explanatory power than other, say, naturalistic hypotheses. So let's go on to consider what the cause of the world would have to be like, right? What sorts of attributes it would have to possess if it would be to successfully account for the existence of the world's existence. Um, so I would want to begin by considering that one important feature of the world that has to be explained um, is the fact that its existence is derivative. Um, and that is just to say that the world is not self existing. And it would seem to follow from this that if the cause of the world is equally owed its existence to something beyond itself, then we would have reason to find um, our hypothesis suspect. And the reason for this is um, borrowing from philosopher Hugh McCann, is that it would do no good to argue that a transcendent cause is needed to account for the existence of the world, only to face the objection that some further agency is required to account for its existence. So in popular debates, sometimes you would hear people ask, "Well, if God created the world, then who created God?" Right? And so it's a similar thing here. I concede totally that um, that would not do if what we're trying to do is um, give an ultimate explanation for why things exist. So uh, one could say that this undermines our argument, but I think it only offers a reason to refine our hypothesis and to propose as a postulate that the transcendent cause of the world has to exist in a non-derivative or a self-sufficient sense. So in other words, the existence of the world would have to find its explanation in a transcendent cause that owes its existence to nothing else, um, whose nature just is to exist, what what philosophers would call a first cause. And we'll see a little bit later that um, there's a similarity between the abductive cosmological argument and then the existential proof that we're going to be talking about, because part of the existential proof is precisely to show that that the cause of the world would have to be such that there is no distinction between its essence and its existence, to the point that you could just say that it would be of its essence to exist. But that's something that we'll unpack a little bit later. Do you have any questions so far?
Well, just I have like a one thought that came up in my head,
Yeah,
and I think I mean you brought up the fact that this argument doesn't really is not concerned with necessarily if the universe always existed, right? So
right.
like let's suppose that in the findings of physics we realize that the universe kind of always existed somehow, right?
Hmm.
I think like David Bentley Hart discusses how the question of existence itself, like something that scientists don't understand is that existence is really not a scientific question, it's or an empirical question, it's an ontological question, right? And I think that for a lot of people that distinction is just really hard to make unless you kind of explore just some basic philosophy, because even if like the universe, right, has always existed for some for an infinite amount of time, right, the question would still be like, but what is it, if you will, about the universe that made it exist or that makes it exist at every moment? That's a different question than just, oh, I have an infinite number of let's say causal events in the history of the universe or whatever. What do you think about that observation?
That's no, that's good. I mean, there's a difference to be made between trying to ontologically account for the existence of something in terms of um, you know prior successive successive causes that may draw out to infinity or not. Um, and like you said, I mean, it's absolutely right. What physics does is deal with um, or rather what physics presupposes is the very existence of the world, right? Physics requires for there to be a world in order for it to do its investigations. It's not the purview of science to explain why the world exists.
Hmm.
And so the very existence of the world is a precondition for there to be empirical science. It's not something that science itself uh, can address, and maybe that's something that we can talk a little bit more about because that's a very good point. And I think just before we move on, I mean, I think there's people just a lot of people just see that it's not very satisfactory to try to explain something in terms of an infinite regress of causes. You know, suppose that you come to my house, right, and then um, we're in my garage, and you see a hammer, and you ask me, "Hey, where did this come from?" Right, and I just tell you, "Oh, it's always been there." Um, you can intuitively see that that's not quite addressing the question that I'm asking, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, I mean, it's the same thing with the existence of the world, right? If you go on to ask why does the world exist, um, it's it's no good to simply say that it has always existed, right?
Hmm.
The question that we're asking is much deeper than that.
Yeah, maybe two last things and then we'll move on. So, I mean, I have an objection in mind that I might want to like just bring up that someone in the audience might have. Do you want me to shelve that until later, or bring it up now, or what are you thinking about that?
We can try it now.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, the first thing is just an observation, and then I'll get into like a possible objection that someone could have. So, when you mentioned, for example, I think it was Richard Taylor and his example of the ball, right? Someone might say, look, um, well, I mean, obviously, that thought experiment, right, isn't trying to say that, the existence of a ball and the existence of the universe are univocal in some sense. You're just trying to say, look, it really is weird when you think about it, or there's something fascinating or demanding an explanation out of something as big and grand as the universe itself. And it seems like when people say, like, oh, it doesn't need an explanation, or they don't care about it, it's like, they seem to be missing something that just seems so obviously, I don't know, crying out for an explanation. Is that accurate? Because I don't want to. I'm worried that someone might say, "Oh, you're trying to say that the two are the same," but it's obvious that the ball is created. So you're trying to say, of course, the universe is created.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not trying to make any allusion to the ball being, contingent, and then arguing from that the world is itself contingent. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just the fact that we ought to find the translucent ball in the forest. We ought to find its existence just as perplexing as we ought to find the existence of the world perplexing.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the objection that I was considering is someone could say, look, okay, you're saying that the universe requires an explanation for its existence, but what do you mean by an explanation? Because for me, I'm satisfied with just like the explanation offered by physics. Why do I need an ontological explanation? Or why do I need an explanation of the sort that you are positing, if that makes sense? So it's not necessarily a question about the properties of the explanation you're offering,
Yeah.
but the question of what would even suffice. What does it mean for something to be an explanation? I know that's a little meta, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
No, that's great. Yeah. So part of the reason why I'm trying to cash out this argument in terms of explanation rather than cause is because, well, first of all, that's typically the language that is used when it comes to abductive arguments in general, because um, there's a parallel with these types of arguments and the types of arguments that we give for particular scientific hypotheses, and those are usually couched in terms of explanation. But also because explanation is just a broader notion than cause, right? So that an explanation, in my view, is just whatever makes intelligible the existence or the occurring of something or event or proposition, um, or state of affairs. Um, and so the sort of explanation that the sort of account that I have in mind is just I'm trying to give, um, I'm trying to reach a conclusion that is broader than just what is the cause of the world, but it's
Hmm.
at the same time, it's open enough that we can, um, for the sake of argument, we can consider a naturalistic explanation for the existence of the world.
Hmm.
But it's just part of the argument that we're considering that those sorts of explanations, those sorts of hypotheses, if you will, don't have as much explanatory power as theism does.
Right. So other atheist philosophers also recognize that, like, the explanation, seeking an explanation for the universe is not like a loaded question in favor of theism. They also
Right.
have naturalistic ontologies. So they
Exactly.
recognize the distinction between just plain physics and then the deeper metaphysics or ontology at hand. But all right,
Yeah.
I'm excited to see the rest of the argument. So,
Cool. Cool. Um, right. So we reached the right now the bare bones conclusion that the existence of the world has to find an explanation in terms of a transcendent cause, right? A cause that we postulated would have to be, uh, it would have to exist in a non-derivative or a self-sufficient sense. Um, and so this cause would have to be such that its nature just is to exist. And that's what we're calling a first cause. Quick clarification, first cause does not mean first in a temporal sense. Um, we mean first in a metaphysically fundamental sense, right? In the sense that it is the ultimate cause of all that is. Um, but we want to be able to say a little bit more. I mean, remember that we're trying to build a hypothesis here, and this hypothesis has to have greater explanatory power than whatever else naturalism may be able to offer. And so we got to be able to say more. Um, I would want to begin with considering the scope of the observable universe, and to say nothing also of the vast parts of the universe that we cannot observe. Um, I think this is enough reason to conclude that the cause of the world has to have, um, if not supreme power, but at least overwhelming power, right? Power just simply being the ability to make something happen. So that's one attribute. I think we can also conclude that the ultimate cause of the world would have to be immaterial, not just because it transcends the physical order of the universe, but also because, as its ultimate explanation, it would have to be responsible not just for the existence of physical substances, but also for the more abstract features of the world, right? Such as numbers, propositions, universals, sets, and so on and on, right? These are just things that are part of the world, part of our particular world. I mean, um, also the ultimate cause of the world would have to explain not just those quantitative aspects of reality, right? Not everything that can be reduced into the language of physics, chemistry, and biology, but it would have to explain those realities that are also qualitative, which arguably cannot be reduced to the physical, such as qualia, so subjective conscious experience, our capacity for abstract thought, among other things. So the cause of the world would have to explain not just the qualitative aspect of things, but also I'm sorry, not the quantitative aspect of things alone, but also the qualitative aspect of things. And given that plausibly those aspects are considered to be immaterial, then the cause of the world would also have to be immaterial, so as to be able to explain those things. Um, Third, we could conclude that there is but one ultimate cause of the world, right? So um, basically, since we're couching this in terms of a scientific hypothesis, we could just appeal to theoretical simplicity, right? There's just no need to appeal to a multiplicity of ultimate causes when one cause alone will do. Um, but you could also consider that the world as a whole exhibits a kind of unity, right? A unity that doesn't really suggest the work of multiple agencies working together to bring about a universe. And I think this is, it's not explicit, but it's at least implicit in people who are, in those physicists who are seeking a theory of everything, right? A theory of everything being an all including um,
Hmm.
theoretical framework by which to explain and to connect all the physical aspects of our universe.
Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah,
and a theory of everything too, to explain, I mean, in some way to explain like the physical universe, unify the laws of nature. It would be a unified explanation, right? It wouldn't
exactly.
be like, oh, well, let me take like maybe, I don't know, five completely separate kind of um, theories and just say that explains it. No, you got to, they're seeking unity. And it seems like, well, if it applies here, it should apply, or applies there, it should also apply in this instance. At least I think that's the argument you're making, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. I'm basically proceeding along the same lines here. Yep. And then we could finally, I think, we could finally conclude that the ultimate cause of the existence of the world would have to be personal, right? And that's on account of the intelligibility and the structure of the world. Um, Again, as philosopher Hugh McCann suggests, quote, the world is a structured one with orderly principles of operations. It has to be. The idea of a universe utterly without formal organization is an idea of nothing at all.
Mm.
It makes sense, therefore, that the producer of such a world would have the intellect to comprehend design and the will to appreciate it. Close quote. So that's one argument that you could give for personhood. Um, Another quick argument that I haven't really quite developed, but just kind of came to my head, uh, and one that as a Thomist I think you'll appreciate, is that you could just appeal to something like the principle of proportionate causality,
Yeah.
right? Yes, I see you nodding. Uh, so yeah, I mean, there is a world in which there are persons, right? And so, given the principle of causality, um, um, that a cause cannot give what it does not itself have
Hmm.
in some way or other, um, that seems good enough of a reason to conclude that the cause of the world, given that there are personal realities in the world, would itself have to be personal
Hmm.
or something analogous to personhood, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and even like the argument on, the first argument that you mentioned about the order and intelligibility of the universe. Like, for instance, people talk about like the uncanny, or just the crazy effectiveness of math.
mathematics.
Yeah, of mathematics, right? And how you can really speak of the world as having certain laws, right? And having order and structure. And it would seem weird if our minds, right, can like mathematically, logically structure the world, and then for the cause of the world to not also be in some way like a mind, like it is intelligible, because then the relationship between the order of the world and our minds would also be accidental. Or, I mean, that's just crazy to imagine. It seems like, no, the world really is what it seems to us, right,
Right.
with this order and the structure
Yep.
that goes well with our minds, if you will. So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, that's something to consider as well.
I agree. I like that. Yeah. Um, so that was what I would call stage one of the argument, right? So we have our hypothesis, or yeah, we have our hypothesis more or less set out, right? If there is, given that there is a world in a world like ours, or actually, wait, I'm forgetting my own argument here. What is the premise? Here we go. If a creative or a personal cause would undertook to create a world like ours, then such a world would surely exist. And so obviously the world exists. So what we're proposing here, right, is that plausibly the world is the result of a creative and personal cause. That's what we've argued too. But obviously we have to consider this hypothesis in terms of rival explanations. Um, and as you said, there are all kinds of naturalistic explanations that somebody could try to propose. So I want to look at about three or four, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to consider them on their own merit, and then we're going to see how they stack up uh, when compared to the theistic hypothesis. So that's kind of the project that we are going to be looking at now. So one hypothesis that we can consider goes like this. Suppose that with the exception of free will and maybe the indeterminism of quantum mechanics, all the present states of the universe can be explained in terms of previous physical states, so states that are governed by deterministic laws. Suppose further that the universe is infinite in the past. Okay, let's just grant that the universe has always existed. What we have on this picture, what we have here is a picture according to which every state of the universe owes its existence to previous states, so that at any given time, all that occurs or exists can be explained in terms of what went on before. And if the existence of things at each point in the world's history can be accounted for, then there's just nothing else to explain, right? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, I see.
Okay. So that's the hypothesis, right? Um, I think it's an ingenious hypothesis, but I think it faces a number of difficulties. To begin with, it's just not at all clear, right, that the assumption of a past infinite universe can be justified. And all we have to do is just look at the present state of physics. According to the present state of physics, right, the idea is that the world appears to have had a beginning roughly about 13.7 billion years ago. Um, and if this is true, then even granting that one could sufficiently explain the present state of the universe in terms of previous states, then such a chain of event causation couldn't go on indefinitely. And so we would need to appeal to something outside the universe to explain its coming into existence, um, which is basically the Kalam cosmological argument, right? Uh, but you wouldn't need to get into the Kalam cosmological argument, but simply just point out that according to Big Bang cosmology, uh, the naturalist is not justified in assuming as a postulate that the universe is past infinite. That's what I'm trying to get at this point. Um, so that's one idea. But secondly, even if we grant that the universe is infinite in the past, right? And even if we grant that the current state of the universe can ultimately be explained in terms of earlier states going on indefinitely, um, I don't think this would suffice as an explanation of the world's existence, because we would be left with no explanation for why the series itself exists, or even why
Mhm.
the particular type of things within the series exists.
Yeah.
And that's what the little diagram at the bottom is kind of trying to get at. Um, Maybe this will make things a little bit clearer. Here's a quote from uh, Hewitt McCann again, and he says this: "The there it is. The problem with the infinite sequence of explanations posed by the naturalist is that as long as each member of a series can be explained only from within the series, we will have no explanation of why the series itself exists, rather than some other series or none at all." Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
he- here's here's another way we could develop that. Suppose, by way of example, that we want to explain the existence of some particular zebra. Okay, it would be fine simply to say that that zebra was begotten by its parent zebras. That seems adequate enough. But suppose now that we want to explain why there are zebras at all, rather than, say, some species that loosely resembles a zebra, or some ecological niche that's completely devoid of zebras. So I think it would be a pretty serious exercise in missing the point if you try to answer that question by postulating an infinity of zebras, each generated by its zebra ancestors. Um, because what's in question is not the existence of some particular zebra, but the existence of the entire tribe of zebras. And that's not something that can be explained from within the tribe, as it were. Um, why there are zebras at all cannot be explained by postulating an infinite regress of zebras. And in the same sense, um, we can't explain the existence of the world by recourse to an infinite series of physical states, because this leaves us with no explanation as to why such a series exists, and let alone why it exists in the way that it does. Um, in in the previous case that we considered, um, recall that the universe is not self-existence. It's not self-existent, um, and so the series in question, um, uh, even if it's infinite, would require as much an explanation as everything else in the universe. Um, but also, in the later case that we considered, we can always ask why the history of the universe is as we know it, given that it needed not be so.
Hmm.
So, in other words, the world having, for example, having the mass that it does rather than some other, or having the structure that it does rather than some other. These are facts that would be left completely unexplained under the hypothesis of an infinite regress of physical states. So even if you grant an infinite series of physical states, you can still ask the types of contrastive explanations, uh, the contrastive questions that we're asking. You know, why is there this particular infinite series rather than some other
Hmm.
particular infinite series? Um, so that is something that the naturalistic hypothesis does not explain very well, right? And by contrast, if our hypothesis is true, then the explanation of the existence of the world um, is to be found in a personal transcendent first cause, which stands in need of no further explanation, right? And whose creation can be explained by recourse to its creative intention. Um, and so, in this sense, I think the theistic hypothesis um, overcomes some of the hurdles that the naturalistic hypothesis succumbs to.
Well, I guess unless you have a PowerPoint slide on this, I remember I talked about Graham Opie's objection from brute contingencies. Is that on the slide, or
Yeah, let me take a look.
because if it's not, then I wouldn't
Yeah,
mind bringing it up.
I don't think it is, but here, let me stop the presentation real quick, and you can go ahead and bring it up, and let's talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So Graham Opie's argument, and I hope I'm representing him properly, but his argument's basically this: look, um, there are some people who say, look, if you have a contingency, then it requires an explanation. But nobody really likes to think about like brute contingencies. So suppose, for instance, like there's something that seemingly requires an explanation, but you're just like, yeah, well, guess what? That's just how it is. Like no further explanation. So for instance, let's say using let's say just an analogy that I could use really quick, right? Imagine that there's a line of infinite numbers of people and they're all wearing like different colored shirts and they have all these different designs on them, and you could say, well, why does this set of people contain, I don't know, these colors in this order? Or why are the people even lined up in the first place? Like all these sorts of questions. And then someone could say, look, it's a brute contingency. It's just a brute fact. It could have been otherwise, but guess what? It's not. And that's as far as the argument goes. And Opie defends this kind of argument by saying, look, the thing is, even theism has brute contingencies. So if you get to have brute contingencies, then I get to have brute contingencies. And if we both get to have brute contingencies, then guess what? There is no kind of rationally compelling reason for me to hop onto your side or for you to hop onto my side. I think Opie kind of recognizes an incommensurability or something there. But how would you approach that? The argument that you have brute contingencies in your view.
Right, right. So the short version is that I don't. The longer version is that um, well, let me try this. Let me try to kind of um, let me try to frame Api's objection one more time, so that
Yeah.
it's because I mean it's clear enough to me, but I want to make sure it's clear for everybody. Um, so suppose that we grant on naturalism, right, that why there are the contingent beings that there are is just a brute fact, right? It's just what it is. Um, if you want to ask the contrastive question of why do we have a world with these contingent beings rather than others, um, that's not something that for which there would be an answer under naturalism. Um, and so Oppie would say, okay, that's fine. but theism doesn't really fare much better in this respect, because you could ask to the theist, okay, why did God create this world with these contingent beings rather than another world with
Yeah.
other contingent beings, right? Um, and so when it comes to giving a contrastive explanation for the contingent beings that exist, Api would take naturalism and theism to be on par with one
Mm-hmm.
another. Um, but then Api would just basically say, well, why don't we just stick with naturalism just for the sake of theoretical simplicity? Um, so I think that's more or less, you know, what Api's trying to get at. So with that in mind, um, to me, it's just not at all clear that naturalism or and theism are on par in this respect. Okay, so it seems clear actually to me that they're not. So, for example, on theism, there is an explanation to be had in terms of God's intentional action, right? And even if God's reasons to create this particular world over some other are inscrutable to us, right? Um, God's reason for creating is not really inscrutable in itself. So, and that's an important distinction, right? We may not be able to figure out why God chose to create this particular world rather than another, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not an explanation to be had.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because whatever the reason surely had, I'm sorry, whatever the reason, God surely had one. Um, but then if you consider naturalism, it's not really clear that there's a similar answer available. Um, I mean, why are there these contingent beings and not others, right? That question just seems inscrutable. And
Mm-hmm.
not just because, uh, uh, and it seems inscrutable to us um, only because under naturalism, the question is inscrutable in itself.
Yeah.
And so that's a crucial difference, I think. But then, um,
Well, one thought that
so
I
if
had.
we,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, let me pitch in with a thought and then see what your take is on it.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of the thoughts that I had to get around this is like considering for a moment, like let's say, okay, there are brute contingencies, right? Um, Under a theistic explanation, we would say like, look, God chose to create a certain kind of world with certain features in it, right? And when you think about, for example, like Aristotle uses the example of, like I think it's like he's holding a stick and he's moving a rock, right? So what moves the rock is the stick. What moves the stick is him. But then Aristotle asks, well, what moved me,
Mhm.
right? And he talks about like the will and the individual and the intellect, right? I mean, it could be the case that is kind of like a brute contingency, maybe, because like I could have chosen otherwise if we assume that I'm free, but the
Yeah.
explanation just terminates naturally in an
Yeah.
intellect, if
Yeah.
that
And I
makes
think,
sense.
no, absolutely. And it terminates in a way that other non-deterministic explanations um, terminate.
Hmm.
That's absolutely right. So, I mean, some philosophers would say that, you know, explanations in terms of free will, um, those are fine to terminate in the way that we do. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's absolutely right. Um,
Uh,
so okay, so it's we can say that it's the indeterminism, uh, or we can say that um, theism fares better because it's able to provide an explanation in terms of God's free
yeah.
agency, right? So
Hmm.
so let's just try to salvage the objection a little bit. Let's say that the naturalist can do something like this. Let's say that the naturalist can appeal to some necessarily existing first state of the world, right?
Yeah.
Something that indeterministically causes the world to be instantiated, right, over some other world.
Hmm.
Um, that would be one way of trying to explain it, but I think it only kicks up the problem a level, because presumably such a cause would have to uh, it would have to operate according to some law or some constant or some kind of governing reality with specific and measurable values. Uh, but then we can begin all over again and ask, why this particular law, or why this particular constant, or
Hmm.
why this particular governing reality with these particular measurable values and not some others, right? Um, and that question would remain as inscrutable um, uh, as it ever was. Um,
Yeah.
and
And
so
just
I
one
think
question.
I think the
Sorry. Yeah.
objection doesn't really
Hmm.
um, doesn't really fare well in that respect.
And another question too is like, must a naturalist be a determinist, right?
Yeah.
Because like, for instance, like if they believe that every physical event precedes like another physical event and that's the ultimate causal explanation, um, and things just couldn't have been otherwise, right? That there's just something determined within the very structure of the world itself. If we have something that is, you said that indeterministically produces our world, or something like that, that seems to be
Yeah.
incompatible with naturalism from the outset. Like it'd be kind of weird,
Right.
you know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, one observation too, just to consider, is like even somebody like Graham Opie in his debate with Ed Feser recognized, yeah. So he actually, so Feser says, look, I have one simple explanation for the existence of the cosmos that is personal, powerful, transcendent. And then Opie's like, yeah, I have an explanation too.
Hmm.
And it was an explanation of simples, right? Multiple physical simples that could break down all of reality and explain,
Yeah.
and then like these physical simples had very interesting properties that were basically like the god of classical theism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the question is then, like, for instance, like a naturalist will say, look, I have brute contingencies. And then I could say, look, okay, fine. Like I have brute contingencies too, because, but the thing is, brute contingencies can be explained by a free agent.
Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely.
So then what is to stop me from saying, yeah, the brute contingency is free agency rather than just brute contingency, if you will,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. No.
nothing more? So I don't know.
That's no. That's right on the ballpark. Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. I think I cut out for just a little bit.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
Okay. Um. No, that's absolutely right. And I want to I want to address this really quickly before we move on to another hypothesis, another naturalistic hypothesis. It's not, it's a sort of similar objection in the sense that it deals with, this appeal to brute facts. Um, but um, I've heard an objection like this that might be relevant to what we're talking about. Um, if 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 the theist wants to say that for the naturalist, the existence of the world that we have, let's just stick with the language of contingency here, but the existence of the world that we have, given that it is contingent under naturalism, is just a brute fact, right? If that's what the theist wants to say, well, maybe the naturalist can say something like this. Um, well, given theism, given theism, God himself is supposed to be a brute fact of sorts, right? There is nothing beyond God that explains God, right? So God is basically where the buck stops, and
Mm-hmm.
that basically just is to say that God is himself a brute fact. And so if we have two brute facts, right, the 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 existence of the contingency of the world, and then God himself, why not go with a simpler explanation? Um, here's the thing. Here's what I would say to that objection. Classical theists are not going to budge here, and they're not going to say that uh, God's existence is a sort of brute fact, right? Because
Yeah.
the idea of a brute fact is the idea of something that is just um, at bottom level completely unintelligible, something for which you cannot really give an explanation of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so classical theists are not going to say that God's existence is a brute fact in that sense. Precisely because we think we can give an explanation for why God exists in the self-existent way that he does, right?
Yeah.
And so that explanation is going to be, um, let's go with, the argument from motion. That explanation is going to be in terms of God's being pure actuality, right? God being completely devoid of potentialities, such that he could potentially go out of existence, or potentially never have had to exist. You could also appeal to, and this is what we're going to be talking about in the second argument, you
Mm-hmm.
could also appeal to God's essence being identical with his existence, such that it is just of his essence to exist, right? And you can consider any number of natural theological arguments, um, the conclusion of which is basically that God exists in a necessary or self-existing uh, manner, not because it's just where the buck stops, but because there are these um, intelligible metaphysical principles with
Yeah.
which we've begun, right?
Hmm.
And God's necessary existence is precisely the conclusion of those particular arguments. So there's a big difference between saying that God exists necessarily because of all of these reasons, and saying that the contingent world exists for no reason at all.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just drop two things and then we'll move on to the
Yeah,
next hypothesis. I mean, the first thing is basically what we've been talking about. When people mention like, "Oh, I have a brute fact" or whatever, it's usually like very ad hoc, right? Like kind of arbitrary, like why you
yes,
pick that brute fact opposed to, let's say, something else, some other fact that I could make brute. On the other hand, under classical theism and the view of God, we're saying, no, 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 this is what seems to just follow, if that makes sense. And it's not
exactly.
following for completely arbitrary reasons, but principles that seem to like have that we have to affirm in order to make sense of reality itself in the first place. I mean, and one example I like using is, if some astronauts like in sci-fi, right? Some astronauts go on this planet and then they see like this, I don't know what they call it. Uh, in 2001 A Space Odyssey, it's the monolith, right? And they
Yeah, yeah,
recognize that like this thing is designed, they recognize that it's of a material, it's of a substance that isn't from the earth, right? And they don't know its chemical structure or whatever. And then like one of the guys says, look, um, I don't know exactly all the properties of the explanation. I don't even know what the intellect or the substance or whatever the creature that created this thing is like, but I
hmm,
just know that it had to be created by something with an intellect and with these certain kind of broad ranges of properties. And that seems to be what we're just talking about with God in a way, right? It
yes,
just seems to be what has to be there, even if we can't perfectly capture every little detail of it.
yeah. That makes sense, and you're absolutely right in the sense that, um, yeah, if you have in mind by a brute fact, um, just a sort of ad hoc way of stopping the buck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not at all what's happening in the case of God, right? Um, and that's precisely because God's God being where the buck stops is the conclusion, the logical conclusion of philosophical arguments, rather than something that we just begin with as a kind of postulate.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that makes sense. Let me jump back to the presentation and let's just talk about maybe two more hypotheses, and then we can consider a few more arguments, and then I'm sorry, a few more objections, and then if you want, we can move on to the second um,
Mm-hmm.
argument. Let me just so the first
Yeah.
one that we've
If you're
considered
constrained
is
on time
infinite.
too, sorry. If you're constrained
No,
on
go ahead.
time, we could like, do the existential proof really quick. Like I just have one kind of objection, another OP objection. So
Okay.
yeah.
I think I'm okay so far. Yeah. Let me share the screen one more time. There we go.
I think you shared there. Wait, hold on. There we
There
go.
it is.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Okay. So we considered the hypothesis of infinite regresses, right? Um, that doesn't fare well with respect to theism. Let's talk about something else. So, for example, the hypothesis that the world came into existence from nothing. Um, and so the way this goes is like this. Some physicists have tried to argue that the universe came not really from some transcendent cause, but just from nothing. I mean, absolute no thing whatsoever. Um, that's what we mean by nothing in the philosophical sense. Um, but when you look at these objections that are typically given by scientists, by physicists, the sort of nothing that they have in mind is not nothing in the true philosophical sense, right? But it's usually an appeal to some sort of murky philosophical phenomenon like the quantum vacuum, which is something that's filled with particles that come into and out of existence, something that's actually very much a concrete reality, right? And then just real quick, the people that I have in mind are people like Lawrence Krauss, Peter Peter Atkins, Stephen Hawking said something similar, but the nothing to which he referred to was actually the laws of nature. And so, in all of these types of objections, to the extent that they're delivered by physicists, they usually have in mind a concrete reality, right? So it's not really a world coming out of nothing. Um, but be that as it may, let's just say that there is a way in which you could cash out to the idea that the universe could have arisen from nothing, right? That's the hypothesis. So what would follow from that hypothesis? Um, I think that to say that the universe could have come from nothing is just basically to affirm against Parmenides that something can come from nothing without a cause or explanation. Okay, uh, but I want to consider the following: if it's possible for things to come into existence uncaused, okay, then it seems that we should expect to observe things spontaneously coming into existence all the time. Um, because after all, if it's possible for one thing to come into existence uncaused, then it seems that it should be possible for any number of things to come into existence uncaused. Um, Jonathan Edwards puts it like this, quote, "If there be no absurdity or difficulty in supposing one thing to start out of non-existence into being, of itself without a cause, then there is no absurdity or difficulty in supposing the same of millions," unquote. So, in other words, if it were possible for something to come from nothing, um, then we should expect to observe a world in which unexplained states of existence were they were a common phenomenon. Uh, Anything from chairs to horses to large chunks of matter to entire galaxies, right? Our universe would have to be one that's marked by unpredictable chaos. Uh, but of course, this is not the world that we experience. And so that undermines the objection. Um, and this is something that philosopher um, Alexander Pruss and Joshua Rasmussen develop in a recent book called Necessary Existence. They call this the argument from chaos. Um, and I'm going to try to, so that's the general idea, but let me try to formalize this now in a way that makes a little bit more sense, hopefully. So the first argument that you could give along these lines goes like this. Premise one: if things can come into existence uncaused, then we should expect to observe things spontaneously coming into existence all the time.
Mm.
Premise two: but we don't observe this. And so premise three, conclusion: things can't come into existence uncaused,
Mm.
right? Um, I think that's a way in which you could undermine the ex nihilo hypothesis. But here's another. Objection two. Premise one: if something can come from nothing, then we should expect to observe a chaotic universe. Premise two: but we don't observe a chaotic universe, right? Our universe is actually very orderly. Um, and even if you appeal to something like the quantum realm, right? Uh, you know, the quantum realm is not, it's not really chaotic. I mean, it is governed by quantum laws and some other things. Um, and so, no matter how you cash it out, our universe is just not a chaotic universe. Um, and so, the conclusion follows that something cannot come from nothing. Does that second argument make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then what do we mean by what we mean by chaos is just kind of just being totally unintelligible or
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Mm.
don't mean anything like, like chaos theory. Um,
Mm.
Basically, what you have in mind by chaotic, I just mean a completely unintelligible universe.
Mhm.
Right. So, um, here's a third argument against the hypothesis that we're considering. Um, the objection would go like this: what's allegedly true of things coming into existence uncaused would have to be equally true of the converse. Okay, so in other words, if things can in principle come into existence without a cause, then surely they can also spontaneously go out of existence without a cause. And that's because, plausibly at least, whatever has the power to create would have to have an equal power to destroy. Um, to put it differently, if nothing can bring things into existence, then surely nothing can bring things out of existence. Does that make sense? And I'm not talking about nothing. I'm not trying to reify nothing as if it were a concrete thing, right? For the sake of the argument, we're appealing to nothing as no thing whatsoever, right? So if no thing whatsoever could bring things into existence, then no thing whatsoever can also bring things out of existence. Um, but obviously, we don't observe things, existing things, just kind of blipping away into nothing. And that itself gives further disconfirmation of the theory that the world came from nothing. And here in the slide, you can see the objection formalized, which uh, it just goes, premise one, if things can come into existence uncaused, then we should expect to observe things ceasing to exist without a cause, right? But we don't observe things ceasing to exist without a cause, and so things cannot come into existence uncaused. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've considered two hypotheses. Let's look at two more, and then we can kind of move on to concluding remarks for this particular argument. Um, Here's another one. This hypothesis would hold that the universe, in some way or other, created itself. So this would be what we can call the self-causation hypothesis, right? This is the claim of Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in their 2012 book, The Grand Design, for example. Um, but this position, however it's cashed out, it would have to turn on the intelligibility of the concept of self-causation, right? Which I think is pretty much as impossible as it is incoherent. And the reason for why is this. I'm going to appeal here to good old Thomas Aquinas. And in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas argues like this. He says, if something were its own cause of being, it would be understood to be before it had being, which is impossible. So in other words, think of some x. Um, if x existed to cause itself, then it would not need to cause itself because it would already exist so
Mm-hmm.
as to cause itself. Um, but conversely, if it did not exist, then it would not be anything so as to be able to cause itself, right? And of course, either scenario is just absurd. And from this, it just follows that nothing can be ontologically prior to itself so as to bring itself into existence. And so, however this is cashed out, self-causation is just
Mm-hmm.
incoherent,
I'm sure that
right?
someone could say, just immediately shoot back, well, you're saying that God self-caused himself. And it's like, well, not in the strict sense of what we're talking about here. And
Right.
that's also like a fine distinction. That is not, we're not just, you know, you know, painting God in a way to avoid these objections. It's like, no, if you really think about what we mean by self-causation in this context,
Right.
right,
Exactly.
that's different than how we understand God as subsistent being itself.
Exactly. That's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely right. Yeah. Okay. Um, let's look at one more, which is everyone's favorite.
Ugh.
Um, Hypothesis number 4: the universe is just a brute fact. Um, okay. So let's suppose that someone were to suggest. Sorry, can you hear
No,
me?
you're
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Yeah. Yesterday, my cat crashed my interview, so
Oh man. Okay, we're good then. So let's just suppose somebody echoes Bertrand Russell, right? The old debate with Copleston, in which he said that the universe is just there, and that's all. Um, uh, Prima facie, I think this is going to strike many people as just nothing more than a refusal to really take seriously the question of the world's existence. Um, uh, Here's what I mean. A hypothesis that seeks to explain X by arguing that X needs no explanation is not really likely to prevail over competing hypotheses that try to give an account of X. And so we should ask, what reasons are there to think that the universe needs no explanation, right? So we need to push things a little bit further. Um, well, here's what Russell tries to do when he talks about the universe being a brute fact. Russell tried to argue in this way. He said, quote, the whole concept of a cause is one that we derive from our observation of particular things, unquote. And so the idea is this: given that we can't really experience or observe the totality of particular things, so the world as a whole, he concludes from this that we have, quote, no reason to suppose that the world in total has any cause whatsoever. Um, and I think Kant also argued for something similar along these lines.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the objection. So what do we make of that? Well, to begin with, I think that there has to be some relevant distinction, right, between the universe and its objects, such that we would be able to say of the universe as a whole um, that it simply just exists and that's that. Um, for the objection to actually carry through. Um, but recall that the universe is not really something different from the objects that compose it. Um, uh, in fact, it's easier to see what the universe has in common with the other objects that compose it than it is to see the way or the ways in which it is supposed to be unique in the sense that the objector thinks. Um, and if you um, and as Richard Swinburne actually notes, even though, quote, every physical object is unique under some description, all objects within the universe are characterized by certain properties which are common to more than one object, unquote. And to my mind, what's definitely common to every object within the universe is just the fact that they are not self existent, that they possess existence in some derivative sense, right? Um, and I think it's this one key similarity that actually justifies us in seeking a cause of the world, uh, and one which the brute fact hypothesis really fails to take seriously. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So that's so much for hypothesis number 4. So in conclusion, wait, there's the quote from
Yeah.
Russell.
Well, it seems like also Russell was kind of maybe a nominalist when it came to metaphysics. He was just like, oh, all these metaphysical principles and the basic observations or statements we make about being and existence, they're just like useful linguistic artifacts, but they don't actually really capture reality, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, and I think that reminds me of it's something that we talked kind of off air. You mentioned an objection to the effect that I'm trying to remember it. Something like this. Let's go with something like that. Suppose a nominalist were to reject the whole project of metaphysics, right, and claim that all things have to be explained in terms of science and empirical observation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I have a slide for this. Let me take a look real quick before I go on. No. Um, can I talk for a little bit about the actual explanatory limits of science? Because I
Sure.
think that might be relevant to at least some people might want to say, why can't I just give some ultimate explanation of the world in terms of physics, chemistry, or what have you? Um, and so this is what I would want to say um, with respect to that. So according to this particular view, it would have to belong to the findings of modern physics to explain why anything at all exists, whether that's in terms of antecedent physical states, like we've seen in the objection of infinite regress, or in terms of some fundamental entity, like, for example, at the quantum level, or maybe in terms of some other quantifiable phenomenon. Um, but here's the thing: when it comes to the question of why the world exists, science is just completely silent. And this is not a claim that can only be justified in light of our present knowledge about cosmology. And it's not a claim that rests on a kind of pessimism about the future, kind of a refusal to appreciate how far we've come in understanding the world and how far we have yet to go. Um, the reason why science cannot, in principle, explain why there is a world at all is because the very question transcends its limits and methods.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what we're dealing here is with a meta-scientific question, and that's a question that belongs, whether they can answer it or not. It's a question that belongs to philosophers and theologians. Um, Here's what I want to say. Um, consider that. Consider anything that physics might be able to tell us at any moment about the world. Okay, it might be able to tell us what the fundamental constituents of reality are. It might be able to tell us something about the quantum space-time foam, about high energy virtual particles, and so on, together with whatever properties that they possess. It may also be able to tell us, it may also help us to accurately model their behavior, right? And it might help us with valuable experimental and observational data. So, in other words, the physicists, as physicists, is only concerned with things insofar as they fall under the umbrella of observation, measurability, abstraction, description, and so on. But the problem is that all of this takes for granted the very object that is subject to the operations of physics, okay, namely the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in other words, physics just presupposes the existence of a world within one can perform different observations and measurements and so on.
Yeah.
Um, it presupposes a world within which one can mathematically uncover the very structural physical phenomena and so on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so here's an example. Let's say that I give you a description of a physical phenomenon, and this is cashed out in terms of simpler phenomena still. So in terms of some root cause or causes, which when connected, they reveal to us some sort of pattern of explanation, right? That's what physics often does. The problem is that however complex this pattern may be, any explanation in terms of phenomena A in terms of phenomena B, C, D, and so on, is always going to presuppose at every step the common denominator that is physical reality.
Mm-hmm.
And why there is a physical reality at all is precisely what's at stake in the question of why is there a world at all. So um, let's go further. Let's say that we want to try to cash out a physical description in terms of transitional states. So in the case of an electron that changes from one energy state to another, it should be clear that the mere observance of some particular event does really nothing to explain why the event exists in the first place. And so that kind of physical explanation also doesn't help. And then finally, what I want to say is that uh, physics speaks in the language of mathematical abstraction, okay, by which we uncover the properties and the structures of things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but we're dealing here with the world's existence, right? And existence is not just a mere property or a structure. Existence as such, right? Um, Moreover, an abstraction, right? This is what it means to be an abstraction. An abstraction not only presupposes an object from which it abstracts, but it's by definition a less comprehensive account than the reality from which it abstracts. And so it's impossible for physics to ever give us a complete description of reality. It's just impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, it's impossible for physics to explain the existence of the very reality from which it abstracts. This is going to be true regardless of whether reality is ultimately reducible to
Mm-hmm.
some quantum event, right? Or whether our universe is but one region that belongs to some multiplicity of universes, or whether there is some comprehensive theory of everything that turns out to be true. It's just, I mean, at bottom, it's just above the pay grade of empirical science to explain
Mm-hmm.
why there is a world at all.
This also reminds me of the claim that the scholastics made that metaphysics is prior to epistemology. I think that's actually really important because a lot of people think
Yeah.
like, oh, you can't really speak of existence or being unless you can somehow demonstrate you know it, right? Or
Yes.
whatever. And then it's like, well, if epistemology is the knowledge of like things, our knowledge of things, of something, right?
Hmm.
Then what you will define as something, right? From that abstraction, if you will, but that is at the bottom of all of our inquiry when we're approaching, these questions. Like I think Otterberg says something in Real Essentialism that our knowledge of essences and metaphysical truths is in one sense certain, compared to like the rest of things, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Just like, for example, our knowledge that 2 + 2 = 4,
Yeah,
is certain. If you, I mean, I think it is, but
yeah.
you know,
No,
mhm,
that makes sense. Yeah, good point. Um, so yeah, that brief excursus aside, I mean, it, yeah. So we can't really, the sort of question that we have in mind is a metaphysical one.
mhm.
Uh, and so, okay, so we've reached the conclusion of our first argument. That's we got there eventually.
Yeah.
Um, so what I've tried to argue here is that the existence of the world calls for an explanation, right? We've given, hopefully, I've given reason to think that the question is in principle answerable, right? And that the best hypothesis for why the world exists, uh, as well as why it exists in the way that it does, is more plausibly found in the existence of a single, transcendent, supremely powerful, immaterial, and personal cause, right? Uh, by contrast, we looked at some competing naturalistic hypotheses, uh, and we've seen that they just don't share the same level of explanatory power, or they've been disconfirmed on their own merits. Um, so I think this suffices um, to show that theism is a better explanation for why the world exists rather
Mhm.
than naturalism. But again, this is an abductive cosmological argument, and so it's possible that some other hypothesis could turn out that could maybe match the cosmological argument that I've given in terms of explanatory power, or maybe surpass it, right? But the point is this, just as it is with any particular scientific theory, unless and until such a hypothesis is put forward, we can conclude with a strong degree of confidence, right, that the existence of God is the most plausible explanation for why anything at all exists. So, so that's that.
All right. So with the existential proof, since we're running a little tight on time,
Okay.
at least I am. Do you want to save it for like another interview, or do you just want to do like a quick rundown of it and then just quickly go over that one objection we had in mind to discuss?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that if you are. How much time do we have?
Um, Preferably like right at 8 is when we should be finished. Well, at least on my end. So like, what is that, in 12 minutes or something like that?
12 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Give me 13 minutes.
Yeah. Wait, did I do
Okay.
my math wrong? Yeah, I did.
Well,
Oh.
well, ah, I got you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's do a quick rundown, and then if you want me to do a separate interview just for this argument alone, so we can unpack it in greater detail, or if
Hmm.
viewers can find me online, and I actually have both arguments in a single Word document that I'd be happy to share with anybody who would want to look at this. Hopefully, I'm looking to turn both of these arguments into distinct papers, not necessarily for publication, but if anybody would want that, I'd be happy to do that. Um, but let's do this. Let's look at the existential proof. So the existential proof is a deductive argument for the existence of God. So we opened with an abductive argument. Um, it's a it's a modest argument, and it at least opens the door to somebody who may be skeptical, and may not usually want to consider these sorts of arguments, right? So opening with that argument allows us to then proceed with a deductive argument. A deductive argument is a much more probative argument. Um, and so I'm going to call this the existential proof, but it began with, it's found in Thomas Aquinas in a book that he wrote titled On Being and Essence. And in this little treatise, Aquinas sets out not first to offer an argument for God's existence, but to really uncover what is the deepest metaphysical reason for why things exist. Um, and so back in his time, there were some, sorry, there we go. There were some schools of which held that um, there are two correlative principles by which one can account for the existence of physical things, and that would be matter and form. Uh, so, in other words, it was because things are composed or constituted by matter, together with a principle that structures that matter, that would be form, that things are said to exist at all. Um, Thomas Aquinas countered that this is not the deepest metaphysical principle to which somebody could appeal. And I won't go into the reasons why, but he thinks that there's two deeper metaphysical principles that one could appeal when it comes to explain at the metaphysical level why things exist in the way that they do. Um, and by things, I want to restrict myself for the sake of time to the things of our experience. Okay. Um, Crucial to this argument that we're going to be discussing is that there is a real and metaphysical distinction between the essence of any particular thing and its concrete existence. Um, Put differently, there's a real distinction between what a thing is and the fact that it is. So, take, for example, two concepts. You have the concept of a triangle and the concept of a unicorn. A triangle is said to be the kind of thing that it is to the extent that it possesses three sides and three angles. A unicorn is said to be the kind of thing that it is to the extent that it resembles a horse with a long, straight, and spirally twisted horn on its forehead. Um, in both cases, right, what we're doing is we're appealing to some formal principle whereby we can have knowledge of what a thing is. And this formal principle, Aquinas called essence, or sometimes you can sometimes it's called nature in a more colloquial way. Um, but what should be clear, though, is that a triangle being such as to possess three sides and three angles, or a unicorn being such as to resemble a horse with a horn, doesn't really tell us anything as to whether such things are or even can be instantiated in the real world. Um, does that make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it would follow from this that the essence of a thing alone does not entail its concrete existence, right? Or if we're going to put it in a more colloquial way, what a thing is does not of itself entail that it is. And the point is that this gives rise to a puzzle. So, in the absence of some cause or some principle that is distinct from a thing's essence, there would be nothing which could make any particular essence to be, that is, to exist in any real way. But even though there are no such things as horned horses or uh, even though there are no such things as unicorns, there are instances of figures that possess three sides and three angles. So, what makes it the case that the latter essence is instantiated in the real world, while the former is not? That's the puzzle. So, this is how Aquinas would solve it. According to Aquinas, there has to be a real principle that is correlative with essence, a principle that belongs to things in a fundamental and irreducible way, to the point that without it, the thing would simply not be. And in fact, without it, there would be nothing simpliciter. And so existence, then, is a real principle or a property of concrete individuals, which, together with essence, explains why they exist, right? So the things of our experience exist in the world by virtue of being essence and existence composites. And that is to say, things that are comprised of two metaphysical principles, which, when joined together, account both for what a thing is and the fact that it exists concretely. Um, I think that is sufficiently clear so that we can move on to. We're just going to go ahead and jump straight into.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we'll jump into the argument, but real quick, here's a formalized way of putting the concern that we have in mind. So there's a distinction between a thing's essence and a thing's existence. Uh, that distinction entails that a thing's essence does not include its existence if there is a distinction to be found. Um, and you could put it like this. Uh, Premise one, whatever belongs to a thing is to be found either within its essence or nature or in some extrinsic cause. Premise two, the existence of the things of our experience is not found within their essence or nature. And so, therefore, the existence of the things of our experience has to be found in some extrinsic cause. Okay? So, the fact that the things of our experience are essence and existence composites entails that they have an extrinsic cause for the fact that they exist. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the argument. And the argument, I'm going to formulate it a little bit differently from the way most Thomists formulate it, but for the purposes of presentation, I want to structure the argument in the most personal way possible, right? So that's by considering your existence and my very existence. So the argument goes like this. Premise one, I exist. Hopefully, I don't need to spend a lot of time defending that. Um, it's just true by introspection. Premise two, what I am is going to be either a thinking thing, if you want to go with Descartes' definition,
Mm-hmm.
or a rational animal, if you want to go with an Aristotelian definition. But what I am, that is either a thinking subject or a rational animal, is distinct from the fact that I am. And so my existence is not explained by the kind of being that I am, from which it follows that it is just not of my essence to exist.
Yeah.
But if my essence is distinct from my existence, and therefore the fact that I exist is not explained by the kind of being that I am, well, then there must be an efficient cause to account for my existing as the kind of being that I am. Premise 7. Whatever ultimately causes me to exist as an essence and existence composite has to be responsible for my existence here and now. And that's because at no point at which I exist does my essence entail my existence.
Mm-hmm.
Premise 8. That which ultimately causes me to exist as an essence and existence composite would have to be either A, itself a composite of essence and existence, or B, it would have to be such that in it, essence and existence are not distinct, but they're identical. They are, those are the two disjunctions. There's no other possibilities. Um, and so, premise 9, if that which ultimately causes me to exist as an essence and existence composite is itself an essence and existence composite, then it too is going to require an efficient cause, since its essence will not account for its existence any more than the essence of a unicorn will account for its real existence. Premise 10, so that which ultimately causes me to exist as an essence and existence composite cannot itself be an essence and existence composite. Premise 11, so that which ultimately causes me to exist as an essence and existence composite has to be something in which essence and existence are not distinct or identical. And then, by way of conclusion, something in which essence and existence are identical is what, among other things, we traditionally mean by God. Okay? And so, from that, it follows that God exists. Um, I know that's quick, and there's a number of ways, a number of premises that have to be defended.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let me just real quick defend what I take to be the most crucial one, and that's premise 7. And then we can maybe go on to discuss Api's objection.
Mm-hmm. I think that we'll have to save that for next
Okay.
time. But if you want to do your defense really quick, I think I can, make time for that. And
Okay.
then we will have a follow-up episode where we discuss the existential
That'd be
proof.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just make premise 7 a little bit clearer, really quickly. The point is this: given that it's not of my essence to exist, right? There's a way in which I can be said to be a dependent being, and that's precisely in the sense that my existence is ontologically dependent upon a cause, or causes outside myself. But the point is this: that when it comes to dependent beings, it's important to note that beings of this category are continually dependent for their existence on other existence. And to see why this is the case, all you have to do is recall that a dependent being exists accidentally, and that the accidental never becomes essential.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the point is that at any moment at which I exist, I am an essence and existence composite. And that means that at any point at which I exist, it is not of my nature or essence to exist, right? So at any point at which I exist, there must be an explanation for my existence. Um, in a future episode, we can consider objections to the effect of, existential inertia and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a quick way in which I would defend premise 7. And then premises 9 and 10 are going to be defended by appeal to what is called um, the distinction between accidentally ordered causal series and essentially ordered causal series. Given that at any, given that I require an explanation for my existence at any point at which I exist, the sort of causal series uh, that is going to be involved there is going to be an essentially ordered causal series, uh, one such that the cause of my existence is going to be a concurrent or an immediate cause of my existence. Uh, and if the cause, and if that particular cause were itself an essence and existence composite, then it too would also require a simultaneous or immediate uh, cause of its existence, right? And so that sort of trail of causes has to terminate in something that is responsible for all the causal powers within that series
Mhm.
in a non-derivative way, right? In a non-borrowed way.
A hierarchical causal series, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
As
Uh,
opposed to a linear kind
yeah.
of temporal
Yeah.
causal series.
And that just follows from premise 7 and the sort of cause that I require at every moment at which I exist. Um, but we'll go ahead and talk about that more in a future episode. Um, do you want to try Api's objection real quick?
Um, we'll save that for the future
Okay.
episode. Yeah. But as of now, like honestly, one thing that I've always noticed about these discussions on the existence of God is that the arguments for God's existence are are a lot of them are just remarkably simple. And at first, like the grandeur of the idea of God existing and the nature of God and so forth. For some people,
Yeah.
they expect that if there's going to be an argument that succeeds or is compelling for the existence of God, then it's just going to have to be somehow incredible and wow you when you see it. But I think that the beauty of these arguments is when you look at them much more closely and you kind of just allow, I mean, I don't like saying this, but when you allow the arguments to speak for themselves, there's actually something very
Yeah.
remarkable. And like for me, like I know that in the past when I was having my doubts, when I was younger and not as philosophically attuned, I
Mm-hmm.
would have been like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. But then now, as I've dived into the
Right.
literature more and I understand like ontology and metaphysics, I'm like, yeah, these are serious arguments. And these are,
Yes.
I mean, I find them utterly compelling, at least from my view. Um,
Yeah.
so let me just close by asking you kind of, I mean, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we end the episode? Anything about yourself, about what you'd recommend to someone who has questions or doubts or that sort of thing?
Um, I guess just real quick, let me just note that I think my information was, I don't know if I included it in the first slide of this presentation, but I'd be happy to make my information available to anybody who wants to reach out either for um, a slide of the presentation, but also for the outline that I've written for both of these arguments, which is fairly substantive. It's about 25 pages for both of these arguments, with plenty of footnotes and resources for anybody who wants to consider these arguments in greater detail. Um, I'd be happy to make that available. But also just real quick, with respect to the existential proof, anyway, here are three books that I found really informative. And one of them is a book by Gavin Kerr. It's called Aquinas' Way to God. And this is basically as far as I know, one of the only full book treatments of Aquinas' existential proof. So I highly recommend that. Um, there's another book by a analytical Thomist named Barry Miller, and it's
Hmm.
called Analysis of Existing. Um, and Miller basically offers a more analytic formulation of Aquinas' existential proof. So I'm not completely on board with all of the principles that he endorses, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. And this would be the sort of book that I would recommend for somebody of a more analytical mind who may have objections to using existence as a real property of concrete individuals. Um, and then just finally, a book that just came out that I would recommend to anybody considering either type of abductive cosmological argument or the existential proof. I think it's relevant in both respects. That's Alexander Proust and Joshua Rasmussen, Necessary Existence. Really good book. Finally, the book that really inspired me to develop the abductive cosmological argument, which I now, I'm I now really favor, is Hugh McCann, The book is called Creation and the Sovereignty of God. And so McCann basically develops a case for classical theism from the ground up in a more analytical language, and it's just a really good book.
Well, let me thank Paulo Juarez for coming on to Intellectual Conservatism today. I really appreciated having this conversation with you. And I mean, I was surprised at how long we went on just the first argument. But these questions, I mean, these questions really are fascinating. And I think people, when they really give them the time and the attention they deserve, not only will they have long conversations, but also very fruitful and productive ones.
Yeah.
So, Paulo, thank you for coming on to the show. Um, and I guess that's the end of this episode. And we will definitely have a follow-up. So thank you, Paulo, for coming on to the show.
Thank you, Swan. Happy to do it again.